So, Lone Rider here, and I wanted to talk about bikes, and in particular, I wanted to talk about vintage bikes and vintage mountain bikes. Now, the problem is that bicycles have been around for, well, in the modern form, quote unquote, as we would know them, with two equal sized wheels, since the late 1800s, i.e., uh, after the transition from high wheeler to uh, what was called at the time the safety bicycle because the wheels were equal or more or less equal size, and the addition, of course, of the chain drive. Now, okay, so it's been around for like 120 years now. Mountain biking has been around for, well, I mean, you could say that if you just mean when you say mountain biking, riding a bicycle off road, you could say it's been around since the inception of cycling. There have been people who rode their bikes off road in the 1800s, and in point of fact, up through the early 1900s, most of the roads in this country were poorly paved. Some places in this country didn't even have paved roads until the 1950s or 60s. So one could argue that, in a sense, in terms of riding on, in conditions that are akin to modern off-roading, in terms of the bumps and ruts and rocks and roots and things that you might encounter, some of the roads were pretty bad. It was like off-roading, essentially. And it is worth noting, by the way, that for all those people who bitch at cyclists, um, it was American cyclists and people in the bicycle industry, as well as um, early cycling lobby groups, that actually pressured the government to go about instituting better paving jobs on roadways. Organizations like the League of American Wheelmen, now called the League of American Bicyclists, a cycling advocacy group that's been around for over 100 years, were instrumental in getting the first truly paved roads um, as part of the American infrastructure. They had the Industrial Revolution gave them these wonderful machines, and they wanted a place where they could actually use them to their full potential. And the roads at the time weren't cutting it. So, um, you know, everybody benefited, but it was the cyclists that set that in motion. Worth noting. So, if there's a nice smooth road that you can drive your car on, that's not macadam or gravel or dirt, but that's actually paved with blacktop with asphalt, please give a thank you to the nearest cyclist you see, because without them, it wouldn't exist. So, just a reminder for all those people who are always, bitching and moaning about cyclists as if they're, something awful. Yeah, but without us, you wouldn't have a place to drive your car either. Um, just saying. Um, so cycling's been around for over 100 years. The mountain biking, like I said, people have been riding bicycles off road ever since bicycling began. And even some of the road riding initially was essentially off roading because the roads weren't paved or graded or whatever all that well, if they were even paved at all. That said, when we think of mountain biking, we think of mountain biking in terms of dirt trails in the woods, as a sport, as a recreational activity, as a, you know, that sort of thing really didn't start until the 70s and 80s. And commercially made mountain bikes, i.e., mountain bikes that you could just walk in and buy off a shelf at a bike shop, you didn't have to put it together in your garage out of parts that you kind of cadged into fitting together, like the early clunkers from the 70s. That really didn't take off until the early 80s. So we could say that mountain biking goes back 30 to 40 years, that sort of range. So you've got, let's see, let's start at 1980. Okay, so you've got 1980, 1990, 2000, and then almost 20 more years. So yeah, just under 40 years. Now, here's the thing. Here's the thing. in those 40 years, mountain bikes have changed dramatically. So when people talk about vintage mountain biking, it's kind of like talking about um, oldies music, right? You know, when I was growing up, oldies was music from the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Um, Now it's like 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. I actually, it was kind of funny. I was listening to a station that it was an oldie station when I was growing up. Now they may have changed the format, but I was listening to it at work the other day, and they were playing songs that came out when I was in college, which in the grand scheme of things, it's been a while, but in the grand scheme of things, isn't all that much long ago. So I was sitting there and I was like, what? Okay, maybe they were 15 years old or whatever, but oldies? And of course, that arbitrary line of what constitutes an oldie is constantly shifting and moving backwards. Um, it's kind of like what constitutes a historical or an antique car. You know, I think 30 years or something is the cutoff. Well, if that's the case, if I still had my 1981 Ford Mustang that I had when I was in high school, I could probably get historic plates for that if I still had that. I'm glad I don't. It wasn't all that well built or dependable. Plus, it had an 8-track player. But, first car, whatever. Anyway, uh, back then in 1996, it wasn't. It was old, being in 1981, but it wasn't an antique. It was just an older car. Now it's an antique car, according to that. And mountain bikes are like that. And when you say vintage mountain bikes, it really depends on the context, because you could be talking about the very first mountain bikes from the early 1980s, completely rigid, almost always steel construction, unless it was like a Cunningham or something. No shocks, or very few of them had any kind of shocks. Sometimes they didn't even have equal size wheels. A lot of times they had a smaller wheel in the back to try and get certain gear ratios because they could only get certain size cogs, etc. Um, this was the early days. The head tube angles were weird. The seat tube angles were weird, etc. Then you started to get bikes that rode more like the mountain bikes we have now, but the geometry was still very different. A lot of them had a very stretched out ride position. People used really long stems. And this is, now you're getting into the early 1990s. This is the era when I started mountain biking. And, when I was growing up, everybody had their the stem on their bike real low, and it was like this long. And they had a narrow flat bar, usually with bar ends of some kind. If you were lucky, you had 3 gears in the front and 7 in the back. Some people had 8, but that was rare. Usually you had a threaded steerer, although threadless or a headset style steerers were starting to make their appearance, along with threadless headsets and stems for them. Those really didn't take off, except on the higher end bikes, until I'd say the mid 90s. But by the mid 90s, they were there and they were making themselves felt. 1995, 1996 is around when that really started to take off. If you got a lower end or even some mid-range bikes, you still had a threaded steerer and a quill stem. But if you got a higher end bike, you would have the new technology, new at the time anyway, of the threadless stem and fork. And then, of course, things changed, and you got into the late 90s and the early 2000s, and the top tube length changed, the stem length changed, how you sat on the bike changed, and more importantly, forks changed. At this point, pretty much every mountain bike had shocks. Rigid bikes were pretty much a thing of the past, except for purpose-built single speeds or stuff like that, basically one-offs. And what you usually had was also more travel in the fork, as well as more adjustability. These things were all good. Now, what it meant on a lower end bike was that you just had a heavier fork with more travel. But on higher end bikes, you've got the increased travel with minimal increase in weight, because the the technology had also improved to the point where they could make things lighter, and so on and so forth. Um, Now, if you had a lighter fork, it wasn't so much about shaving weight off the entire bike. It was really more about keeping the weight balanced, so the bike wasn't front heavy. But the point is, at this point, everybody's got a fork. It's pretty much kind of like where things are now, except for brakes and wheel size. And then in the mid 2000s, you started to see 29ers come out. Then people realized they were basically too big for everybody who wasn't really tall. Especially with mountain bikes where you want top tube clearance so you don't bang your what you use it. If you put a foot down in a on an uneven surface. So you either have to have a really sloping top tube and really high bars because it's going to jack the front of the bike up to have clearance for the wheels and increase your wheelbase. So it really wasn't well suited proportionally wise to anybody who wasn't particularly tall. But they had just spent all this money convincing people that the 29er was way better than those old 26 wheels that people had been using since mountain bike took off, basically by accident because the first mountain bikes were built on, old clunkers cadged together from balloon tire bikes from the 50s, and those all had 26-inch tires, so that's what it ended up as being. It wasn't like in the beginning of mountain biking, somebody did a scientific study and said this is the best wheel size. However, it's the size that people for 30 years had grown accustomed to using, or 25, 30 years had grown accustomed to using. It was the size that a lot of turns on trails that were built with mountain bikes in mind, were designed to accommodate bikes of roughly this wheelbase with these wheels, etc. So, and of course, almost all the accessories, fenders and tires and things available on the market were for 26. But they were starting to move away from that, and they had just spent all this advertising money trying to convince people that 26 sucked and 29er was, the greatest thing since sliced cheese. So they couldn't just say, oh, we were wrong and go back to 26 and just leave 29er as an option for taller people or somebody who wanted a bike with a bigger diameter wheel. So what did they do? 650B, which for some reason they started calling 27.5. So that's where we are now. A lot of bikes are 650B. I refuse to call it 27.5 because it's actually smaller than a old 27-inch road wheel. So I'm not going to call it 27.5. I'm old enough to remember a 27-inch road wheel. So, yeah, but that's where we are now. 650Bs, some 26s, some 29ers. And pretty much everything is disc only now. You have some entry-level bikes that still have rim brakes, but pretty much anything that's not, a lower tier bike is going to have disc brakes. It's going to come with them. And even the bikes that don't come with disc brakes do come with the fittings attached. Now, that's great in terms of it gives you an option to install disc brakes if you want. What's not so great is that you don't have the option to install cantilevers or V-brakes, linear pro brakes, whatever you want to call those. Now, you could say, well, who would do that? Well, a lot of us are running older equipment. The whole point of talking about vintage mountain bikes is that there's a lot of people out there who are into vintage gear. This came to me. I have a friend of mine who was building up a fairly rare frame, some kind of strange alloy. I don't want to say magnesium. I can't remember exactly what it was made out of, but it was a fairly unusual bike, and it had a lot of, it was in mint condition. It had never been really put together. And he had a lot of old vintage parts, and he was trying to put it together. But he had a newer fork. The fork was from like the 2000s. The bike was from like the mid-90s. And he said, how come when I put this fork on it, it jacks the bike up like this? Now, this guy's very knowledgeable about older road stuff, but I tinker a little more with mountain biking, despite also being a roadie myself. So I basically, I said, well, the forks, the later forks had a lot more travel, and so what you're essentially doing is you're increasing the length of what's under the steerer tube, so you're bumping the bike up in the air like a chopper essentially, and in doing so you're altering your head tube angle, you're altering the trail of your front wheel, and you're altering your seat tube angle. Now that's not necessarily a bad thing, although it may be. Depends on how much you're altering it and how you're altering it and all that stuff. But the point is, the bike's not going to ride like it would with the fork that it was designed for. I mean, this is the whole reason that modern bikes, modern bikes have the opposite problem. If you want to put a rigid fork on a modern bike, you have to get one that's suspension corrected, right? What does that mean? It takes into account the extra height that would be there from a suspension fork, because that's what the frame's designed for. But if you take an older bike that had a short travel fork and you go to put a big one on it, boom, it jacks the bike up. And that's true even if you're using a vintage fork, if it's a vintage fork from the wrong period of vintageness. Because like I said, there's different, what's vintage? 10 years old, 20 years old, 30 years old, 40 years old. Mountain biking hasn't been around nearly as long as the rest of cycling, but it's been around long enough that there are distinct, almost like eras, in terms of the type of technology that was used. At one point, everybody had friction thumb shifters. Then you had index shifting, but you had, it topped out at like 7-speed. Then you had, 8, 9, 10. Now you have some bikes have 11 speeds on the back. Forget about whatever they have in the front. And then there's the whole one-by thing, which I'm not going to get into now. The point is that when you're talking about vintage bikes, you kind of have to specify what you mean, because cycling's been around a while. And even mountain biking, the newest, one could arguably say, branch of cycling, of the cycling family tree, is old enough. I mean, mountain biking's been around, if you go back to the mid to late 70s when it really started, mountain biking's been around pretty much as long as I have. So, that's a long time, right? Not a real long time, but long enough that it's accrued a variety of different technologies and types of parts. And there's stuff that doesn't. If you have a threadless 1 1/8 inch headset, right? It's not going to work with a threaded 1 1/8 inch headset. I bet you didn't even know there was a threaded 1 1/8 inch headset, right? A lot of people figure you had threaded headsets, which were 1 inch, and then you had the threadless, which were 1 1/8. Well, there was a transitional period where they had 1 1/8 threaded. In fact, at one point they had 1 1/4. What? 1 Yeah, they did. Okay, there was a lot of weird stuff going on back in the day. Now, what's interesting is nowadays you have the same type of thing with tapered head tubes. You essentially have two different size headsets in one. The cup on the bottom is different than the cup on the top, and same thing with the bearing race and the ring of bearings and all of that stuff. So you're sort of moving back in that direction where stuff is getting very particular, and it's not going to be. For a while it was, I won't say like it was standardized, because the bike industry has never been standardized in the sense of universal measurements or anything like that, but it was pretty stable, as stable as it gets for a while. Now you've got 3 different major wheel sizes, and who knows how many small ones. You've got all kinds of weird stuff, and things like tapered head tubes and the requisite headsets to go with them, where it's not even like you can look at it and say, okay, the top and the bottom bearings are the same size. They're different sizes within the same headset, right? So things are changing really fast, and you know what? Today's bike will be tomorrow's vintage. But the point is, when you're dealing with vintage mountain bike stuff, you really got to specify what you mean by vintage, because mountain biking's been around long enough that there are different kinds of old mountain bikes. And as my friend said to me, he said, look, I just kind of figured it's a suspension fork. And I said, yeah, but there's a lot of different kinds. And the way I explained it was, the older suspension forks were shorter travel for several reasons. One, I think people had a lot more skill back then. They relied on themselves to do a lot more of the work. Secondly, I don't think people were doing as extreme stuff back then as some riders do now. And third, a lot of the bikes that people were using didn't have suspension forks originally and were being retrofit. Now, if you're going to put a suspension fork on a bike that originally doesn't have it, even if you thought to build a long travel one, it wouldn't fit on a bike like that without jacking it up. So, the original forks were short travel for several reasons. One, it was a benefit just to have suspension. And two, I don't think they needed it, again, because people weren't doing as much extreme stuff. And the people who were relying on their body and how they distributed their weight on the bike to do most of the work rather than a suspension fork, because up until then, that hadn't been a thing, outside of maybe some one-off built in some guy's garage. So, the way I basically described it is the forks had to be backwards compatible. You're coming out with suspension forks, but they're new. A lot of people don't have them. If they want to install them on their existing bicycle, the fork has to be such that it fits. And again, people didn't. They were just starting out, so yeah, the travel's going to be less. And maybe people didn't need that much travel. They figured anything was a bonus, and they had been used to getting by without, and they weren't doing extreme stuff like some people do now, and yada yada. But basically, you need to know what error parts you're dealing with in order to know the interchangeability. And, road riding is steeped in history. And that's one of the cool things about it, You have a legacy that goes back over 100 years. But what people shouldn't forget is that mountain biking's been around for a while, too. Not as long, but long enough that it also has some history. So, as a roadie and a mountain biker, just throwing that out there. There's more than one kind of vintage mountain bike, and mountain biking in that sense, really does have its own history and its own evolution. So, Lone Rider out.